The first thing Howard Kelly noticed wasn't the young woman. It was the silence. Rabbi, his border collie, had barked at every stranger who ever came up that road for 6 straight years. Peddlers, preachers, bankmen, even the mailman on a bad day. But that afternoon, Rabbi trotted down the dirt path with his tail low and easy, and sat himself right beside the traveler like he'd known her his whole life. Howard set his coffee cup down slow and reached for the rifle propped against the porch rail. The woman coming up the road walked like every step cost her something. Her boots were cracked at the toes. Her canvas saddlebag hung flat and near empty against her hip. Dust had settled into the creases of her face until you couldn't tell if she was tired or just weathered that way. Permanent. She might have been 24. She might have been younger, if the road had aged her early, which out here in 1886, it usually did. Louise came to the screen door, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "Howard, who is that?" "Don't know yet." The woman stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and pulled off her hat. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid, and there was a thin scar above her left eyebrow that hadn't healed all the way. "My name is Julia Brown," she said. Howard kept the rifle low, but ready. "This is private land." Julia looked past him, toward the pasture where 40 head of cattle grazed in the afternoon light. Something in her eyes changed when she looked at those cows. Something that wasn't hunger. "Let me stay," she said. "I'll take care of your cattle." Louise made a small sound behind the screen door. Howard almost laughed. A stranger, alone, filthy from the road, offering to work cattle like she was doing him a favor. "We don't take in drifters," Howard said. "Never have." "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work." I said no. Julia held his eyes a moment longer than a beggar should dare. Then she nodded, put her hat back on, and turned to walk away. That was when the sky split open. Lightning struck the ridge above the north pasture with a crack so loud it rattled the windows of the house. The cattle screamed and broke in every direction at once, crashing through the fence line like it was made of string. Thunder rolled over the valley a second time, and the herd scattered toward the canyon trail, the one place on the whole ranch where a stampede could kill every animal in it. Howard's rifle hit the porch floor. Julia was already running. Howard's rifle hit the porch floor. Julia was already running. Louise stood frozen in the doorway, one hand pressed to her chest, watching a stranger sprint toward danger that wasn't hers to face. Howard, go with her! He didn't need telling twice. His old bones protested every step, but fear for his herd, and something he couldn't quite name yet about the woman running ahead of him, pushed him faster than he'd moved in years. The ranch that grief built. Kelly Ranch sat at the foot of the Laramie Range, 400 acres of good grass and bad memories. Howard and Louise had built it from nothing over 30 years. 2 rooms and a dream that had grown into a working cattle operation that fed half the county come market season. They had raised one son on this land. His name had been Daniel, and he'd been gone 3 winters now, buried under the cottonwood tree behind the barn, after a fever took him at 19. Howard hadn't cried at the funeral. He'd built a fence instead, working from sunup to dark until his hands bled, because grief needed somewhere to go, and Howard didn't know how to let it out any other way. Louise grieved different. She kept Daniel's room exactly as he'd left it. She set an extra plate at supper some nights, out of habit, then quietly took it away before Howard noticed. Mostly he noticed anyway. He just never said so. Since Daniel's death, Howard had refused every hired hand who came asking for work. He told himself it was about money, about trust, about not needing help from strangers who'd take his food and his wages and give nothing honest back. The truth sat closer to the bone. Howard was afraid of loving anybody new and losing them too. Making things worse was Kim Sutton, a land buyer from Cheyenne who'd been circling Kelly Ranch for 2 years like a hawk over a wounded rabbit. Kim wore tailored coats and polished boots that never touched real dirt, and he smiled the way men smile when they already know how a conversation is going to end. "Name your price, Howard," Kim had said just last month, sitting his fine horse at the edge of the property like he already owned it. "You're an old man, working a young man's land. It isn't going to get easier. This land isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale, Howard. Question is whether you sell it now for a fair price or later for nothing, after the bank forecloses on you." Howard hadn't answered that day. He'd just watched Kim ride off and felt the weight of 30 years pressing down on his shoulders, a little heavier than before. There had been other hands before, of course, in the years right after Daniel passed. A pair of brothers who drank more than they worked. A quiet older man who lasted a season before moving on to easier ground. Each time one left, Howard told Louise it proved his point, that hired help never stayed, that it wasn't worth the trouble of caring whether they did. Louise had stopped arguing the point out loud. She simply kept flour on hand for a little more bread than 2 people needed, and kept hoping, in the quiet way a person hopes for something they've stopped saying out loud, that someday somebody would walk up that road and stay. That was the ranch Julia Brown walked into, tired, grieving, holding on by a fraying thread, and it was about to change forever. Julia didn't think. She ran. The canyon trail dropped fast toward a narrow gorge where the creek cut through solid rock, and if 40 head of spooked cattle hit that gorge running blind in a storm, half of them would go over the edge. Julia had seen it happen before, on a ranch that didn't exist anymore, on a night she tried hard not to remember. She grabbed a coiled rope off the fence post as she passed and swung herself onto the nearest saddled horse, an old gelding named Samson, who Howard used for slow work around the barn. Samson wasn't built for a chase like this. He'd have to be enough. Rain came down sideways. Lightning kept cracking the sky into pieces, and every flash lit up another terrified animal crashing through brush toward the canyon rim. Yah! Julia dug her heels in and rode the ridgeline, cutting ahead of the herd instead of chasing behind it, the way her father had taught her a lifetime ago on land that belonged to somebody else now. She got in front of the lead cow, a big rust-colored animal with wild eyes, and turned her hard left with nothing but her voice and the flap of her wet coat. The lead cow turned. The herd followed. Behind her, Howard came riding up on his own horse, rifle left behind, face white with fear he'd never admit to. He watched a stranger he'd refused 20 minutes ago, turning his entire herd away from death, with nothing but grit and a rope she didn't even use. By the time the rain slowed to a drizzle, every single animal stood safe in the lower pasture, shaken but alive. Julia sat on Samson's back, soaked through, breathing hard, blood running from a scrape on her forearm where a branch had caught her. Howard rode up beside her and just stared for a long moment. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could your herd." He looked out at the cattle, counting without meaning to, 40 head, all of them standing. "Get down off that horse," Howard said finally. "Louise will want to look at that arm." It wasn't a thank you, but it was the closest thing Howard Kelly had said to a stranger in 3 years. Julia slid off Samson's back, and her legs nearly buckled under her. Weeks of walking with barely enough food had left less strength in her than she wanted anyone to notice. She caught herself on the fence rail and straightened up fast, hoping Howard hadn't seen. He had. He didn't say anything about it, but he walked a half step closer to her the rest of the way to the house, the way a man walks near something he isn't sure is steady yet. Louise met them at the porch steps, already reaching for Julia's arm before either of them said a word. "Inside. Now." Both of you look like you swam here, instead of rode. Herd safe, Howard said. I don't care about the herd right now, Howard Kelly. I care about the two people standing in my yard soaked to the bone. Louise's voice cracked with something between relief and scolding. The exact tone she used to use on Daniel when he came home late from the creek as a boy. She caught herself using it and went quiet for a moment before pulling the screen door open. Get in here, both of you. A place at the table. Louise cleaned the cut on Julia's arm at the kitchen table, while Howard stood by the stove, arms crossed, pretending he wasn't watching. You rode into a lightning storm for cattle that weren't yours, Louise said. Why? Because nobody else was going to. Louise studied her for a moment. There was something in the way Julia held herself, straight-backed even now, exhausted and bleeding, that reminded Louise of somebody. She couldn't place who yet. You'll stay the night, Louise said. That's not a question. Howard opened his mouth to argue, and then closed it again. He'd spent 3 years building walls around this ranch, and in the space of one storm, a stranger had ridden straight through every one of them. One night, he said. Then we'll talk. Julia nodded and didn't push for more. She'd learned a long time ago that people who needed convincing usually convince themselves faster if you let them get there on their own. Rabbi settled at her feet under the table, like he'd claimed her as his own personal responsibility. Howard noticed that too. His dog had never once done that. Not even for Daniel's old friends who used to come around for Sunday supper. That night, lying in the small spare room off the kitchen, Julia listened to the rain finish its business on the roof and thought about the last time she'd slept somewhere that felt this much like shelter. It had been almost a year. Before the bankmen came. Before the fire. Before she learned that trusting the wrong person could cost you everything you'd ever built. She wasn't planning to trust anyone here either. She just needed enough work to earn a stake and move on before anyone got close enough to ask questions she didn't want to answer. That was the plan, anyway. Morning came, and Julia was already in the barn before Howard finished his coffee. He found her mending a section of fence the storm had torn loose, using scrap wood and wire like she'd done it 100 times before, because she had. Told you, one night, Howard said, standing over her with his arms crossed. You did. Julia didn't stop working. Figured I'd earn my breakfast before you tell me to leave. Howard watched her hands move, quick and sure, tying off wire the same way his own father had taught him 50 years back. Nobody learned that from wandering. Somebody had trained her right, and trained her young. Where'd you learn ranch work? Same place anybody learns anything. Doing it wrong until I did it right. He let that sit. He wasn't ready to push harder. Not yet. But something in her answer had more weight to it than she was letting show. Over the next several days, Julia worked from before sunrise until after dark. She fixed the fence properly, all the way around the north pasture. She noticed a calf favoring its leg, and treated an infection before it spread. She rebuilt a section of the barn roof that had been leaking for 2 winters. Something Howard had meant to fix and never got around to. Mostly because Daniel used to be the one who climbed up there. Howard watched all of it from a careful distance, the way a man watches weather he isn't sure he trusts yet. She's not just passing through, Louise said one evening, setting supper on the table. You see it too, don't you? I see a woman running from something. Maybe. Or running towards something. Doesn't have to be the same thing. Howard didn't answer. He was thinking about the canyon, about the lightning, about how a stranger had risked her life for cattle that weren't hers, and hadn't asked for a single thing in return, except a place to sleep and honest work. He was also thinking, though he wouldn't admit it out loud, that for the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel so empty. There was a morning that same week when Howard caught Julia sitting on the top rail of the corral fence before sunrise, just watching the cattle move in the gray light. her breath fogging in the cool air. He almost turned back toward the house without disturbing her, but something made him climb up onto the rail beside her instead. "You always up this early?" "Habit," Julia said. "My father used to say the ranch tells you the truth before the day gets busy enough to lie to you." Howard turned that phrase over in his mind. It sounded like something his own father might have said, decades back, on land that had long since passed out of his family's hands. Smart man. He was stubborn too. Wouldn't take help from anybody, even when he should have. "Sounds familiar," Howard said, and for once, he wasn't talking about her father. Julia glanced sideways at him, and something passed between them, an understanding neither one needed to put into words. Two stubborn people, each carrying grief the other recognized without needing it explained. "I used to think needing help made you weak," Howard admitted, surprising himself with how easy the words came. "Buried my son, thinking that. Nearly buried this ranch thinking it too. And now?" Howard watched the cattle graze, the mist burning slowly off the grass as the sun cleared the ridge. "Now I think maybe I had it backward the whole time." Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. The sun came up over Kelly Ranch that morning on two people who understood each other a little better than they had the night before, and that understanding would matter more than either of them yet realized. Wait, she carried. It took 2 weeks before Julia said much of anything true about herself, and even then it came out sideways, over a fence she was mending with Howard on a quiet Sunday afternoon. "You ask a lot of questions for a man who never says why he wants to know," Julia said. "You avoid a lot of questions for somebody who claims she's got nothing to hide." Julia set down her hammer. For a moment, the only sound was wind moving through the grass. "I had a ranch," she said finally. "Montana. My family's, 4 generations. I ran it myself after my parents passed. And I ran it well. Better than most men in the county gave me credit for." Her jaw tightened. "Then a banker convinced me a loan would help me expand. Told me it was a good deal, friendly terms, said it like he was doing me a favor. I trusted him because he smiled, like Louise smiles, like he meant it. What happened? He called the loan due 18 months early, right after a bad drought season, right when I couldn't pay. Foreclosed on everything. Sold my family's land to a cattle syndicate for less than half what it was worth. And I still don't know if that was bad luck or if he planned it that way from the start." She looked out at the pasture. "I lost the ranch. I lost the only home I'd ever known. And I learned the hard way that trusting people costs you, sooner or later." Howard didn't say anything for a long while. He was thinking about Kim Sutton circling his own land the same patient way a hawk circles something wounded. "That's why you don't stay anywhere long," he said, "so it can't be taken from you again." Julia looked at him, surprised he'd understood that fast. "Something like that." "Well?" Howard picked his hammer back up. "This land's mine, free and clear. Nobody's foreclosing on Kelly Ranch." "Everybody says that right up until somebody does." Howard didn't have an answer for that one. He just kept working, and so did she, and something between them shifted that afternoon into a kind of understanding neither one said out loud. That night, Julia sat by the window in her small room, looking out at the dark shape of the mountains against a sky full of stars, and let herself remember more than she usually allowed. She remembered the day the sheriff came to post the foreclosure notice on her family's front door, how she'd stood on the porch and watched everything her grandfather built get reduced to a number written on a piece of paper. She remembered riding away from that land for the last time, telling herself she'd never let a place mean that much to her again, because places you love too much are the places that break you when they're taken. And yet here she was, 2 weeks into a job on somebody else's ranch, already lying awake at night, worried about a herd of cattle that wasn't hers, already caring more than she meant to about an old man's approval and an old woman's kindness. She pressed her palm flat against the cool glass of the window and made herself a quiet promise. She would help this family however she could. But she would not let herself need this place. Needing things was how you ended up with nothing at all. It was a promise she was already failing to keep, though she wasn't ready to admit that to herself yet. Kim's quiet war. The sabotage started small enough that Howard almost missed it. A gate left open that let 6 cattle wander onto County Road. A water trough gone bitter and undrinkable, though nothing obvious had fouled it. A fence post cut clean through in a spot that wind alone couldn't explain. Julia noticed the pattern before Howard did. "This isn't bad luck," she told him, crouched beside the cut post with her fingers running over the clean edge. "Somebody's doing this on purpose. Who'd want to hurt this ranch? Who's been asking to buy it?" Howard's face went hard. Kim Sutton. He rode to town the next morning and found Kim at the hotel, drinking coffee on the porch like a man without a single worry in the world. "Somebody's been sabotaging my property," Howard said, standing over him. Kim didn't even blink. "That's a serious accusation, Howard. You have proof?" "I've got a cut fence post and a poisoned water trough." "Ranching's a hard business. Accidents happen." Kim sipped his coffee. "Though I'll say, if you're struggling to keep your own property secure, that's just more reason to consider my offer. I'd hate to see something worse happen before you come around to good sense." It wasn't a confession. It was close enough to one that Howard's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Get off my land the next time I see you on it," Howard said, and walked away before he did something he couldn't take back. Riding home, Howard thought about Julia's words from the fence line. Everybody says that, right up until somebody does. He was starting to understand exactly how right she'd been. When he told Julia and Louise what had happened at the hotel, Julia's expression turned hard and focused in a way Howard hadn't seen from her before. "Men like that don't stop because you tell them to," she said. "They stop when it costs them more to keep going than to quit." "What do you suggest?" "We watch. Every night, in shifts, until we catch him doing something we can prove." Julia was already thinking 3 steps ahead, the way she must have once thought about protecting her own family's land, back before it was too late to save it. "He's careful, but careful men get overconfident when nobody's caught them yet. He'll slip. We just need to be watching when he does." Howard looked at her for a long moment. This drifter who'd walked up his road hungry and empty-handed only weeks before, now standing in his kitchen laying out a plan to protect his ranch like it was her own life on the line. In a way, he realized, it was. She'd already lost one home to men exactly like Kim Sutton. She wasn't about to stand by and watch it happen twice. "All right," Howard said. "We watch." For the next several nights, lanterns stayed dark and eyes stayed open along the fence lines of Kelly Ranch, waiting for Kim Sutton's next move. A family forming. Despite the trouble circling the ranch, something good was growing inside it. Louise had taken to sitting with Julia most evenings, teaching her to quilt while they talked. And somewhere in those quiet hours, Louise found herself laughing again, a sound that hadn't come easy since Daniel died. "You remind me of him," Louise said one night, needle pausing mid-stitch. "Not in how you look, in how you give everything to whatever's in front of you, and never once think to keep some back for yourself." Julia didn't know what to say to that, so she just kept quilting. Howard noticed it too, though he'd never say it as plain as Louise did. He noticed it in the way Rabbi followed Julia everywhere now, in the way Julia had started fixing things around the house that weren't even cattle work, in the way Louise had stopped setting that extra plate out of habit, because there was finally somebody sitting in the chair it belonged to. One afternoon in late May, Julia was up on the barn roof replacing a shingle, when Howard's old rooster, a mean-tempered bird named General Grant, decided to take exception to a ladder being propped near his favorite fence post. The rooster charged Howard mid-climb, wings flapping, spurs out, and Howard went down into a hay pile with a shout that brought both women running. Julia looked down from the roof at Howard, sitting stunned in the hay, General Grant strutting away like he'd won a war. And she laughed so hard she nearly lost her own balance and had to grab the chimney to keep from following Howard down. "Laugh it up," Howard grumbled, picking hay out of his collar. "That bird's been planning that for a month. He's been planning it since Daniel was a boy," Louise called from the porch, unable to hide her own grin. "That rooster's outlasted 3 dogs and 2 ranch hands out of pure spite." Even Howard couldn't keep the scowl on his face for long. It was the first time in longer than he could remember that laughter had rolled that easy across the yard, and something in his chest eased a little more with every second of it. There was a night in early June when a young rancher from the next property over, a good-natured fellow named Everett Colt, came calling with an excuse about borrowing tools he clearly didn't need. He lingered on the porch talking to Julia until well past dark, and Howard watched from the window with an expression Louise hadn't seen on his face in years. Something close to a smile. "Careful," Louise teased him. "You're starting to look like a father." Howard didn't argue the comparison. He just watched Julia laugh at something Everett said, watched the easy warmth between them, and felt something in his chest loosen that had been clenched tight for 3 long years. Julia wasn't looking for romance. She'd told herself the same thing about staying, that she told herself about everything else, that it wasn't permanent, that she couldn't afford to want it to be. But Everett kept finding reasons to ride over, and Julia kept finding herself glad when he did. And some things a person can't talk themselves out of feeling, no matter how hard they try. One evening, he walked her down to the creek after supper, the two of them talking easy about nothing important, the kind of conversation that matters more for how it feels than what gets said. Everett stopped at the water's edge and looked at her a long moment, the kind of look that made her forget, just for a second, every reason she'd built for keeping people at a careful distance. "You ever think about staying somewhere for good?" he asked. "Not just working it, belonging to it." Julia looked out at the water, moonlight breaking apart across the current. "I used to think belonging was something that got taken from you the second you let your guard down. And now? Now I'm not so sure." She glanced at him, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself smile without holding part of it back. "Ask me again in the fall." Everett laughed, low and warm. "I intend to." He didn't try to kiss her that night, though the moment sat right there, waiting for it. He just walked her back to the porch, careful and unhurried, the way a man courts something he already suspects is worth being patient for. Julia lay awake a long while afterward, her heart doing something unfamiliar and a little frightening, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The trap in the canyon. Kim's patience ran out in late June. He tried buying Howard out. He tried scaring him out through small sabotage. Now, with the ranch stronger than it had been in years thanks to Julia's work, Kim decided on something bigger and far more dangerous. He paid 2 men to drive a portion of the herd toward the canyon during the next storm, the same canyon that had nearly claimed the cattle the day Julia arrived. If Howard lost enough animals to a second disaster, the debt from replacing them, combined with a bad season, would finally force him to sell, exactly like Kim wanted. Julia found out by accident, overhearing 2 riders talking low near the property line about a job they'd been paid for, and a storm rolling in that night. She didn't waste time telling Howard the long way. "Kim's paying men to run part of the herd into the canyon tonight," she said, already saddling Samson. "During the storm. Then we ride together." "No, You watch the house in case this is a distraction for something worse. I know that canyon now. I can move faster alone." Howard grabbed her arm before she could mount up. "You almost died there once already." Julia met his eyes, steady despite the fear underneath. "This ranch gave me the first honest home I've had in over a year. I'm not going to watch it get stolen out from under people who took a chance on a stranger." Howard let go of her arm. There wasn't time to argue, and some part of him understood there wasn't any argument that would have worked anyway. Julia rode into the storm a second time. Loyalty costs. The canyon trail was worse this time. Mud instead of dust. Lightning cracking closer with every flash. Julia found the two hired riders already pushing a portion of the herd toward the gorge, shouting and waving torches to spook the animals faster than nature alone would have. "Stop!" Julia rode straight at them, and for one terrifying second she thought they might turn their horses on her instead of the cattle. They didn't. Whatever Kim paid them, it wasn't enough to risk a killing, and when Julia came at them hard and fast, torchlit and furious, both riders broke off and fled into the dark rather than face what was coming. That left Julia alone with a herd already running, scared toward a canyon edge she knew too well. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs. Old fear rising up fast. Memories of another night, another herd, another disaster she hadn't been fast enough to stop. For a moment, the mud and the dark and the screaming cattle blurred together with everything she'd lost in Montana. And her hands shook so hard on the reins she nearly lost her grip. Then she thought of Howard's face when he found her the first time. The way Louise had held her hand while cleaning her wounds. The way Rabbi curled at her feet every single night like she belonged there. This wasn't Montana. This was hers to protect now, and she wasn't going to lose it the same way twice. She dug her heels into Samson's sides and rode. She did what she'd done the first time. She rode ahead, cut in front of the lead animals, turned them with her voice and her body, and pure, stubborn will. But the ground was slicker this time, and halfway through the turn, Samson's hoof caught a hidden root, and both of them went down hard into the mud. Julia hit the ground and rolled, cattle thundering past close enough to feel the heat of their bodies. Close enough that one misstep would have ended everything. She lay still until the herd passed, rain soaking into every part of her, ribs screaming where she'd landed on a rock, and then she got up anyway because the job wasn't finished. By the time Howard found her, she'd gotten every last animal turned safely into the lower pasture, and then collapsed against the fence rail, unable to stand another minute. "Julia!" Howard was off his horse before it fully stopped, kneeling beside her in the mud, checking for broken bones with hands that shook harder than they had in years. "Herd's safe," she managed. "Count them, all of them." Howard didn't count cattle. He pulled her against his chest, mud and rain and all, and held on the way he hadn't held on to anybody since he buried his son. "I've got you," he said. "You hear me? I've got you now." For the first time since her family's ranch was stolen out from under her, Julia let herself believe that might actually be true. A home earned, not given. Julia's ribs were bruised but not broken, and Louise fussed over her for 3 straight days, refusing to let her lift so much as a coffee cup. Kim Sutton showed his face at the ranch one final time a week later, riding up with the same confident smile he always wore, unaware that Howard already knew everything. "Come to make your offer again?" Howard asked, standing on the porch with Julia beside him, both of them steady and unmoved. "I heard you had some trouble with your herd," Kim said, not even bothering to hide his satisfaction. "Terrible thing, losing cattle to a storm." "Funny thing about that storm," Julia said. "The 2 men who caused it told the sheriff everything this morning. Once we explained how much time they'd spend in a territorial prison for attempted theft and endangering a person's life. They gave up your name pretty fast once they understood what was actually at stake." Kim's smile finally cracked. "You've got nothing," he said. "I've got 2 witnesses and a sheriff riding out here within the hour," Howard said. "You've got about that long to be somewhere else in this territory, Or you can explain your business arrangement to a judge instead." Kim didn't say another word. He turned his horse and rode away from Kelly Ranch for the last time, and this time, everyone watching knew he wasn't coming back. That evening, Howard sat Julia and Louise down at the kitchen table with a document he'd ridden to town to have written up properly by the county clerk. "This makes you an equal partner in this ranch," Howard said, sliding the paper across the table. "Not a hired hand, not a guest passing through, a partner, with your name on the deed right next to mine." Julia stared at the paper for a long moment, throat too tight to answer right away. "You don't have to do this." "I know I don't have to." Howard's voice was rough. "I want to. This ranch was dying before you walked up that road, Julia. My grief was killing it slower than any drought could. You gave it back its life, and you gave Louise and me something we thought we'd lost for good." "What's that?" "A daughter," Louise said softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "We didn't expect to find one at our age, but here you are." Julia signed the paper with a hand that wasn't quite steady, and somewhere outside, Rabbi barked once at nothing in particular. The happy kind of bark, the kind that meant everything on this ranch had finally settled into place. Everett Colt came calling again that same week, and this time, Howard didn't just watch from the window. He invited the boy in for supper, and by the time autumn came around, the whole county understood that Julia Brown wasn't a drifter passing through Kelly Ranch anymore. She was home in every way a person can be. The lesson in all of it was simple enough that even a tired old rancher and a stubborn young drifter could learn it eventually. Family isn't only the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the people who show up in a storm and stay to fight for something worth saving. And trust, once broken, can still be rebuilt, brick by brick, fence post by fence post, if two people are stubborn enough and honest enough to try. Kelly Ranch stood for many more years after that spring, stronger than it had ever been, because a homeless drifter once asked for nothing more than a chance to work, and an old man learned, just in time, to say yes. Come autumn, just as Julia had promised him by the creek that night, Everett Colt asked her the question again, and this time she didn't need until fall to know her answer. Louise cried at the small wedding they held right there in the pasture where Julia had first turned the herd away from disaster, and Howard walked her the short distance to stand beside Everett, giving away a daughter he'd found in the strangest way a man ever found one. On a spring afternoon when lightning split the sky, and a stranger asked for nothing more than a chance, Rabbi sat at the edge of the gathered crowd the whole ceremony through, tail thumping against the grass, watching over Julia the same steady way he had since the very first day she walked up that dusty road with nothing but a worn saddlebag and a promise she intended to keep. If this story moved you, stay close, because there's more of this journey still to come. Subscribe to see how it all continues to unfold, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I would love nothing more than to say hello and find out just how far the story has traveled to reach you.